Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. This video is dedicated to the synth right here next to me. It's the Waldorf Iridium. I've had mine for a few weeks now. Very glad to have it, but this is the first chance that I've had to do a video on it. Now, if I see in social media one question about this synth above all others, it is, well, what's the difference between it and the Quantum? Which one should I buy? Now, I can't tell you which one you should buy. That's a very much a personal decision, and it's a decision that you have to make for yourselves. But hopefully what I can do in this video is give you an idea of the main differences between these two synthesizers. I'm not going to go into every single tiny difference, but I'll give you the main ones. Certainly the ones that sort of stand out to me, having used both these synthesizers now for a little while. So that's what's coming up in this video. I really do hope you enjoy it. Thanks very much for watching. Right, so the first difference, it's the most obvious difference, and it is the form factor of these two synthesizers. The Quantum, it's a keyboard synth, full size 61 note keyboard here versus a desktop module with the Iridium. And to be honest with you, for me, that would be the deciding factor pretty much. I mean, either you've got the room for a keyboard and you want a keyboard, or you don't. So really, that's the biggest difference. It's the most obvious difference. You don't need me to be telling you that. That being said, the Iridium is a rather large desktop module. It's the largest desktop module that I've actually had. Well, it's exactly the same size as the Kyra, which I did a little review on a while ago. It is a big desktop synth, and you need a big desk. I don't have enough room on my desk for this synthesizer. I don't have enough room, full stop. So that's a bit of a problem. However, Waldorf have been very clever. They've put a Vaser mount on the back of this, basically just 4 little bolt holes. And if you don't know what Vaser is, it's a standard mounting system for computer monitors and televisions, in fact. And it really is a big standard. There's so many different mounts and brackets that you can get that are Vaser compatible. This is, I think Vaser comes in 3 different sizes: 75mm, 100mm, 150mm, I think. The Iridium is 75mm in terms of the bolt holes on the back of it. So as long as you get a bracket that can fit it, as I've done here, I've got it with a very cheap little sort of desktop mount here. I can swivel it around, I can move it exactly where I want. If the cables are pulled through, I can tilt it, swivel it, do whatever I like with it. It's really handy. I can push it all the way out if I want to when I'm not using it, and otherwise I can have it right here in my face or to the side or whatever I want to do. It's really nice. This is the first synth that I've had on a kind of a sort of a swivel stand, if you like. I just think it's a brilliant idea. So it is a very large desktop module. But the options that you have for mounting it are really good. So the difference in form factor is going to obviously have a impact on the front panels, the number of controls that we've got on these front panels. Before we get into those controls and into this sort of like pad section here on the Iridium, let's just talk about the screens very, very briefly. They are a different size between the Iridium and the Quantum. Certainly there is a difference in aspect ratio. The Iridium screen is far more like a sort of a widescreen TV kind of aspect ratio, whereas the Quantum screen is a little bit more sort of like square. Also, the Iridium screen is more sensitive than the Quantum screen. It's newer technology, it's more sensitive. You can use a stylus with it, whereas you can't, or I couldn't get a stylus to work on the Quantum at all. So there is a little bit more sensitivity there. Is it light years difference in sort of like the experience between these two synths and their screens? No, it's not. They're really quite similar, a little bit more sensitivity. But I think for me, what makes the Iridium a better experience is the fact that I've got it on this bracket, on this mount, and I can move it exactly where I want to. I can have it exactly, you know, the right distance away from me, rather than, you know, with a keyboard where it's fixed. So I think that makes a big difference to me personally anyway. But it is a better experience, but not light years different to the Quantum. So let's talk about the physical controls on these two synths and what's different. And clearly the most obvious thing here is the Iridium has this sort of performance pad grid section here, whereas the Quantum has a keyboard. Now I've seen an awful lot of discussion on social media about this section here on the Iridium, and I think it's fair to say that the majority of people are not keen on it. But then there are probably people that don't own one of these synths anyway, just have an opinion about it. I can understand why Waldorf have put it here, but it does take up a lot of room, and that means there are less controls available on the front panel than there are on the Quantum. Now for me personally, I do use this performance section, not for any sort of live playing. I don't do live playing, but it's nice to be able to just power it on, select a preset that I want to sort of like configure or change, or want to create a new preset, and I've got the ability to play it. There are different modes here. These are just notes, semitones, or we can play scales, and we can play chords. And all of this stuff is configurable. You can save your own presets, so that's quite cool. It's nice to be able to trigger the synth standalone, because otherwise, if I want to do some sound design on this synth, I've got to power up my MIDI controller keyboard, I've got to power up, switch on and power up my computer, I've got to run some software there that'll do the MIDI mapping between ins and outs, and then finally I can press some keys and I get the sounds out of the Iridium. So I can bypass that whole thing just by switching this on. Let's now take a quick look at the physical controls and how they differ between the two synths. Obviously the Iridium is a compromise. There's less room for physical controls, so there's less of them, and they are closer together than you'll find on the Quantum. Personally, I don't find a problem at all with how close they are. They're very, solid, high quality controls. I don't find myself knocking them and changing them by accident. They are sort of like, clearly grouped together. It's easy. I don't have a problem at all. And again, it helps the fact that I've got this thing on a bracket, on a mount, and I can position it wherever I like. That really helps as well. So what have we got here in terms of controls and what's missing or different compared to the Quantum? Now I think that, just talking about the Quantum for a second, it's a hardware interface, but it's all software inside. And the danger or the inevitability really is that the hardware interface will get left behind as the software develops and improves and more features are added to it. And I think that's what has happened with the Quantum. I mean, the Quantum on the front panel here, we've got 3 LFOs and we've got 3 effects and we've got 3 filters. But in reality, when this Quantum was launched, it had 6 LFOs, 6 envelopes and 5 effects, and there's no way with any buttons or anything on the front panel to switch between those different LFOs, effects and filters. Just taking the LFOs for example, wouldn't it be nice to have just a little button where I could just press it and then we'd be looking at LFOs numbers 4, 5 and 6 instead, but there isn't. So I wonder when they designed this front panel that they didn't anticipate having any more than 3 LFOs or more than 3 effects or more than 3 envelopes, and they've added those afterwards. So you've got a hardware interface in the Quantum that's actually a bit out of date, and then obviously with version 2 firmware they added the kernel capability, the kernel engine, which gives us sort of frequency modulation capability, and that is sort of like completely devoid from the front panel of the Quantum because clearly it came after the front panel was sort of like set in stone, if you like. So they've made improvements with the Iridium, which I do like. If we just look at the little LFO section here down on the bottom right, we've got a little dial to choose which of the LFOs of the 6 that we want to select, and then we've got controls for that particular LFO. Now obviously, if in the future they added 2 more LFOs and made it 8, suddenly this is stuck as well, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the only way to get around that is to have, I don't know, little LED displays or something like that where you choose what your LFO number is. But it's better than what we have on the Quantum, where you can change all the LFOs from the front panel. In terms of the envelopes, again, we can change all of them from the front panel. We've got 2 rows of controls here, so we can change 2 envelopes at a time, and we've got a select button as to which pair of envelopes we can access. So here we're accessing the filter envelope number 1 and the amplitude envelope, which is the most common to be choosing, or we can choose filter envelope number 2 and one of the free envelopes, and then finally we've got the last 2 free envelopes. So that's again nice that we can choose between them. It's a little bit strange that we've got a button to select here and we've got a dial to select here, but there you go. The oscillator sections are improved over the Quantum as well. As I mentioned, we've got the kernel engine now, and we can just press 2 buttons and activate the kernel engine. It's very obvious from the front panel what we're doing here. It's labeled, whereas it's not on the Quantum. And I like the way that they've laid out these different oscillator algorithms here in these sort of like 4 little quadrants that we've got here, and then they've labeled them on the front panel as well. I think it's much more obvious to see if I choose a resonator what changing these controls will actually access by the labeling. So they've improved that as well. So what's missing? Well, the obvious omission for me, and the thing I miss the most, there are no physical controls here for effects. and I really like the fact that I could have physical control over, well, 3 effects on the Quantum. If I just want to turn up a little bit of reverb, I add a little bit of delay, it's just great to have a dial to do it. I can't do it now on the Iridium. I'm going to have to go to the effects section here. I'm going to have to choose my effect by touching here, and then I can turn a control up here to add it. I just like the fact that I had physical controls for effects, and they're gone, which is a shame, because really it could have just taken up this much room here for effects. Choose the effect and then have my 2 controls. Never mind, I don't have them. What else is missing? There's no physical glide controls here. You have to go through the screen and the menu system to get at the glide controls. What else is missing? I think that's pretty much it. Compression. There's a dial on the front panel for compression. There isn't with the Iridium here. So, you know, there are some things missing. It is a compromise, and as I said before, Waldorf are never going to satisfy everybody with their choices. But I think that what we've got here is really, really usable. I like the improvements that they've made, and my niggles are very, very minor, I have to say. I even like the pads here, although it does take up a lot of room. Okay, so there's still more to talk about in terms of the outside, and that's the connectivity across the top here, but we'll get onto that bit later. I think now's the right time to get inside these synths and see what's different about them. I mean, in terms of the synth engines themselves, they are pretty much identical. We've got the same algorithms in the oscillators, we've got the same algorithms in the digital former, we've got the same complex modulator, envelopes, LFOs, effects, etc. It's all the same. There's one sort of like main fundamental difference between these 2 synths, and that is the dedicated dual filter section. On the Quantum, it's an analog circuit, and on the Iridium, it's a digital circuit, as in a virtual analog emulation circuit. So why do we have this difference between the filter sections in the 2 synths? Well, I think it comes down to polyphony at the end of the day. The Quantum is an 8-voice polyphonic synth, and that polyphony is limited by the physical circuitry inside the synth for these analog filters. You don't have that limitation inside the Iridium. There is no physical circuitry inside it. It's all emulation, it's all virtual analog at the end of the day. The Iridium is a 16-voice polyphonic synth, but there's probably no limitation, physical limitation inside here as to why it's set to 16 voices. Probably the only limitation is the amount of processing power that the Iridium has got. But potentially the polyphony could be increased on the Iridium, whereas I believe it's very, very difficult to do with the Quantum. Certainly Waldorf haven't managed to do it yet, and all the signs from them are it's a very, very difficult thing to do. They don't want to say for certain it's not going to ever happen, but I wouldn't hold your breath. So the difference with the filters is actually improving the polyphony on the Iridium. Now 8 voices of polyphony is absolutely fine for a polysynth, but what you need to remember is that both of these synths are multitimbral, they are bitimbral. You can play 2 presets at the same time, you can layer them on top of each other, or you can split the keyboard. And when you do that, your polyphony is halved. So on the Quantum, you're then down to 4 notes of polyphony only. But with the Iridium, you're down to 8, and 8 is still very, very usable for playing big fat chords and that kind of thing. So the polyphony is very much a deciding factor for me as to when I want to play the iridium versus the quantum. But are we lose something by having digital filters as opposed to analog filters? Now, that's what's going to come up next. I'm going to give you a little bit of a comparison between these two different filters and how they sound. So I've got a simple patch set up on both the Iridium and the Quantum just to try and show you how similar the filters can sound. One is a physical analog filter on a chip, and the other one is a software emulation of that same filter. They're not going to be identical at all. You know, they're going to have their differences, but they're going to have similarities. And I think they sound really quite similar. I think they've done a very good job emulating on the Iridium the analog filters on the Quantum. Now, in terms of the digital filters themselves on the Iridium, you have a filter model to choose from. You've got PPG, Nave, Largo, you've got a state variable filter algorithm as well, and you've also got a quantum model. So these are very specific emulations that they've sort of like hard coded in software, and the quantum one is trying to match the analog filters on the Quantum itself. So this is what the Quantum sounds like with my little patch. I'm not going to get the levels exactly right because I'm having to turn them up and down as I go, but this is what the Quantum sounds like. And this is what the Iridium sounds like. That was the Iridium, here comes the Quantum again. Alright, let's do a little filter sweep here, just a comparison between the real analog filter on the Quantum versus the emulation on the Iridium. So first we will hear the Quantum. This is the 24 dB low pass and 50% resonance. And now the Iridium. Maybe we'll go for 75% resonance, just try another comparison. Okay, so let's go with the Quantum again. So there's one more advantage of having digital virtual analog filters as opposed to physical analog circuits for filters, and that comes down to stereo. Now what happens in the Quantum is that you can have stereo sound sources. The oscillators support stereo, but when they go into the filters, the analog filters, even though you've got two of them, the output from those filters is monophonic. And I'll just demonstrate that very, very quickly on the Quantum. So I've turned down the resonance. I'll switch to the oscillator that's playing the waveform. And if we go to the control tab on the oscillator, there's a pan. You can pan the oscillator left and right. That's fully right. That's fully left. And that's in the middle. The only difference is in the middle it's a little bit louder than left or right, but it's not stereo. However, if I were to divert this oscillator and bypass the filter altogether and do the same thing, now you can hear that it's a stereo oscillator, right and left. But I have to bypass the analog filters in order to do that. Now the analog filters on the Quantum, they have a sort of a stereo effect. It's called stereo mode, with three sort of strengths to it. And what that is it is a stereo effect. It's putting some stereo back into the sound again, but it is an effect. It's not the real natural stereo that we started out with in our sound source. So it's a compromise at the end of the day. You lose the stereo nature of your oscillators. And if you're playing, stereo samples with your oscillators using the particle engine, then it's a real shame that the analog filters lose that stereo capability. However, we don't have that issue with the digital filters on the Iridium. So if I do the same thing, I'll turn down the resonance. There we go. And I go to the oscillator, and in the control section I pan it right and left. You'll hear that we have maintained the stereo signal path through the filter. And even better than that with the digital filters, because on both of them, you've got a pair of filters, a pair of analog filters, a pair of digital filters. If we go and switch them to a pair, what we can do is we can actually set up each of those filters to be independently panned differently in the stereo field. So we can actually have true sort of stereo filter output from the filter section inside the Iridium. See if I can set that up. So as soon as we're into two filter mode, we've got a tab for each of the filters. This is the first filter we've been playing with. Here is the second filter. I can adjust the cutoff of that and the resonance of it separately. And depending on which one I'm choosing, I can set the pan of them. So let's pan this filter all the way to the right, and let's pan the first filter all the way to the left. And now you'll hear that there is a stereo nature to the sound. So for me, that's another really, really big plus with the digital filters. They might not be as exactly the same as the analog filters, but they bring much better benefits in terms of polyphony and in terms of stereo capability. But at the end of the day, it's horses for courses. It's what you really want and what you think is the most important thing with both of these synths. Right, one final thing I want to mention that's the difference between the Iridium and the Quantum, and that is in terms of the connectivity. On the back panel here of the Iridium, we've got some CV connectors. We've got 8 of them in total. We've got 4 CV inputs. We've got a clock input. We've got a gate input. We've got a sync input as well, a separate sync input, and we've got a clock out. So we've got a fair amount of connectivity here for connecting up to Eurorack gear, modular gear. Now where you see these inputs coming in is in the mod matrix. If I go to mod matrix here and I scroll through the sources, just make sure my arms are in the way, towards the end of the list, a long list that we've got here, you'll see that we have got the CVs, the CV sort of start, sync and gate. So we can use those as modulation sources to then modulate whatever we want to inside the synth. So we've got some CV connectivity that, which is nice to see as well. So those are the main differences between these two synthesizers. There are more than that. Certainly there's more when you go into the screens. But certainly in terms of the firmware, I'm sure that those changes and improvements that you see in the screens will ultimately find their way back into the Quantum as well. But for me, if I can summarize, the main differences between these two synthesizers is keyboard layout versus desktop module, and analog filters versus digital filters. And what those digital filters give the Iridium that the Quantum doesn't have is it gives it the stereo capability, and it gives it 16 voices of polyphony. So for me, very personally, the Iridium compared to the Quantum really is a big fat stereo pad monster of a synthesizer.